From Indiana to Gettysburg, Erie to Jeffersonville, this is Lincoln Radio Journal. On this edition, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has triggered a constitutional crisis by usurping the power of the legislature to redraw congressional district lines. Now lawmakers are considering impeachment. State Representative Chris Dush is here to talk about impeaching the justices. The city of Pittsburgh has officially been in distress status for years. But on this week's Allegheny Institute report, we find the Steel City emerging from state oversight. And you'll get more money in your pocket as a result of the federal tax cut. But here in Pennsylvania, Governor Tom Wolf is looking to help himself to some of it. Beth Ann Mumford of Americans for Prosperity Pennsylvania has this week's Lincoln Radio Journal commentary. I'm Loman Henry, and welcome to Lincoln Radio Journal. We'll get to State Representative Chris Dush in just a couple of minutes, but first, news headlines from PAtownhall.com. On the campaign trail this past week, Republican gubernatorial candidate Scott Wagner spoke to the Pennsylvania Press Club. His remarks focused on how to address the rising number of school shootings that have taken place throughout the nation. While Wagner outlined a number of steps that he would take as governor to protect school children, his call for a mandatory death penalty for anyone convicted in a school shooting has drawn the most attention. It also sets up a clear point of disagreement with Governor Tom Wolf, who instituted a complete moratorium on implementing the death penalty when he took office. Wagner is set to face off with retired Pittsburgh businessman Paul Mango and Pittsburgh attorney Laura Ellsworth in the upcoming May primary election. Candidates for Congress are adapting to the new congressional district map put into place by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. While the legal wrangling over the districts continues, candidates have begun circulating petitions to have their names placed on the May primary ballot. In two major developments, State Representative Steve Bloom, who is set to compete in the seat being vacated by Congressman Lou Barletta, who is running for the U.S. Senate, says he will now run for the seat being vacated by the retirement of Congressman Bill Schuster. Bloom's residence now falls in the Schuster district under the new district lines. And State Auditor General Eugene DePasquale, who openly toyed with the idea of challenging incumbent Congressman Scott Perry for a seat now based in and around Harrisburg, has decided not to make the race. Congressman Perry's district remains on balance Republican, but slightly less so than under the previous map. On the Democratic side of the ballot, the race for lieutenant governor, already crowded, got a new contestant this past week as the former deputy mayor of Philadelphia, Nina Ahmad, announced that she is ending her bid for a congressional seat and will instead seek her party's nomination for lieutenant governor. The redrawing of congressional district lines made Ahmad's candidacy for Congress less competitive. In the race for lieutenant governor, she will square off against incumbent Lieutenant Governor Mike Stack, who is also from Philadelphia, and a number of other candidates. Stack is viewed as vulnerable due to a number of high-profile scandals and a lack of support from Governor Tom Wolf. Stack also failed to gain the endorsement of the Democratic State Committee, and unusual development for an incumbent. We invite you to keep informed on all statewide news and policy issues by reading the all-new PAtownhall.com. In what many view as a clear violation of both the U.S. and state constitutions, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has, by judicial fiat, implemented its own congressional district map. Since both constitutions give that power to the legislative branch, lawmakers are understandably fighting back. And one way they may hold the court accountable is by impeaching one or more of the justices who participated in the decision. Here to talk about how and why this could happen is State Representative Chris Dush. Representative Dush represents a district in Jefferson and Indiana counties. Chris, welcome back to Lincoln Radio Journal. Chris, we have talked over the last couple of weeks, actually for months, about this whole redistricting kerfuffle that's been going on. But for those who may not be up to date or who may not yet have heard about it, what is the situation with the redrawing of Pennsylvania's congressional district maps?
First of all, the Supreme Court came to a decision that the maps that were drawn back in 2011 for the congressional seats and none of the other seats but for the congressional seats in particular, were unconstitutionally gerrymandered. My problem is not with them having that per se. I've actually read all 139 pages of their opinion, which we finally got 2 days before the deadline. But my problem is with their order, which mandated that we act in violation of Article 4, Section 15 as relates to how pieces of legislation are passed. These maps are actually pieces of legislation. They're very detailed, right down to sometimes dividing up wards and precincts. What they did was January 22nd, they gave us an order that said we had to have a map drawn and submitted to the governor by February 9th. And then some of them apparently took off to Florida for a while, and we didn't get their opinion, which would have allowed us to figure out how to draw those maps until February 7th, which was 2 days before the deadline. On its face, the original order cut the constitutional required time for pieces of legislation to be available for the governor's consideration from 10 days down to 6. So the legislature was actively moving towards getting something done. And then, to compound it, once the governor and the legislature had not come to an agreement yet, under the Constitution, if the governor vetoes a piece of legislation, it comes back to the legislature for reconsideration. Well, they just said in their order, we're just going to reach in, seize that, and take ownership of it and write it on our own, which is a straightforward violation of Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, which mandates that the legislatures be the ones who write that piece of legislation. As far as the unconstitutionality of the gerrymandered districts, that is not a part of my actions as far as the impeachment. The impeachment resolution goes directly to the unconstitutional directions that they filed in their January 22nd order, and then the subsequent violation of the Constitution where they took ownership of a piece of legislation. This actually goes back to basically 7th and 8th grade civics in American history. We have 3 branches of government that respectively write, administer, or interpret the law, and there are separations of powers there. And the sovereignty of the Constitution, the sovereignty of being able to write those, resides with the people and the legislature. The executive administers, and then the courts interpret. What the courts have done here is flip the entire Constitution on its head and de facto rewrote it without actually writing the change into the Constitution.
Chris, when we look at this, of course, as you've pointed out correctly, the Constitution of both the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the United States of America each give legislative branches certain powers, judicial branches certain powers, executive branches certain powers. Now we have the Supreme Court, which by any even casual observation has appropriated unto itself powers that are reserved constitutionally for the legislative branch. So aside from impeachment, is there any other control on the Supreme Court? Any other branch, for example, you as a legislator have to stand for re-election every 2 years. The governor has to run for re-election after 4 years. These men and women on this court are essentially in lifetime appointments. They get 10-year terms, and then they have a retention, not a re-election. So what is the way, whenever they do violate the Constitution themselves, bring them back into accord with those documents?
The only way right now under the Constitution in a situation like this is impeachment. The U.S. Supreme Court should, and I hope will, recognize that it's both a violation of the United States Constitution and the Pennsylvania Constitutions and will overturn the ruling as far as the district maps and that kind of stuff. And where we proceed from there, I'm not sure. The judges that we have right now, the justices, one of them openly campaigned on this particular decision ahead of time and was actively supporting the case. When he was asked to recuse himself, not only did not, but the Supreme Court, from what I understand, has allowed that justice to decide whether he had acted inappropriately or not. Now, who allow somebody to be their own judge, jury, and prosecutor?
Now, you're talking about Justice Wecht, and this brings us to a side but related issue, Chris, and that is We have been told for decades upon decades that the Supreme Court is to remain above politics and it's to have these lengthy terms. And when they campaign for office, they can't tell us what it is they're going to do because that might prejudice their judgment. And they sort of place themselves above the other branches of government and try to cloak themselves in this mysterious judicial power that they have. But now we have a justice who campaigned specifically. He was quoted in the media as saying that he wanted to throw out the map, that he wanted a redistricting. Now he sits in judgment of it. How is that not at least a violation of the judicial canon of ethics, if not, and I think you're on the right track, an impeachable offense?
It is, I believe, an impeachable offense. It's bad conduct, and that is basically what is up to the legislature to make a determination on. Very frustrated with the fact that the Pennsylvania Bar Association did not call him on it while he was actively campaigning. I think the Bar Association stumbled there, as well as other legal, professional, and judicial people around the Commonwealth. They should have stepped in.
How does the impeachment process work?
Impeachment articles will come before the House. If they vote to accept the articles and move forward with prosecution, the House now becomes the prosecutor and takes it before the Senate, where the Senate can convict with a two-thirds majority.
Is this going to end up being a partisan issue, Chris? I would think that in terms of the legislature and having the legislature's power unconstitutionally taken from it by another branch of government, it really wouldn't matter what party you are if you're serving in the legislature. Wouldn't you think that just about everybody would be opposed to having the court encroach upon its territory in that way?
Well, they certainly should, and indeed, I've actually had some indication from the other side of the aisle that they are very concerned with this, and they've got questions. They're a little hesitant, but on the other hand, they recognize that if we allow the courts to go down this road, they start into the realm of an autocratic rule, and if the court ends up flipping and it becomes partisan on the other side, then it could go exceedingly bad for them in future years. Both parties, they should be concerned. If they're not, they might want to go back and take a look at, like I said, a 7th or 8th grade civics class and the history behind how our country was founded and the wisdom in people like James Madison, the father of our U.S. Constitution, and others who studied the rise and fall of nations. And this republic that we've been given is a precious gift, and it's held up because we've been able to put those checks in place and prevent the usurpation of power.
No doubt a constitutional crisis has been triggered by the actions of the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. And we have been talking with State Representative Chris Dush, who is moving forward with resolutions seeking the impeachment of Supreme Court justices who have clearly, in the opinion of, well, at least Chris and I and many, many others. Chris, it's been interesting. A lot of people have been stepping forward saying that this time they've gone too far and this is an impeachable offense. So we will continue to keep an eye on this. Chris represents the 66th Legislative District based in Jefferson and Indiana County. Chris, what is your website if folks would like to learn more?
Just www.repdush.com.
We have been talking again with State Representative Chris Dush. Chris, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
The city of Pittsburgh is no longer under financial distress status. Here with a look at the history of that journey are Frank Gamrat and Eric Montardi from the Allegheny Institute.
Hello and welcome to the Allegheny Institute Report on the Lincoln Institute Radio Journal. I'm your host, Frank Gamrat, and with me today is my colleague, Allegheny Institute Senior Policy Analyst, Eric Montardi. Eric, how are you today?
I'm doing fine, Frank. Thank you very much. It's a beautiful day here in Pittsburgh.
To segue right into it, our fair city had been in Act 47 status for the last, close to 15 years, and so there hadn't been too many beautiful days. Why don't you fill our listeners in on what Act 47 status is and how our fair metropolis found its way in there in the first place?
Sure. Act 47 is a state law. It was passed in 1987, and it's a law that deals with municipal financial distress. So when a municipality exhibits one of a handful of criteria that is related to its finances and its ability to carry out services for the benefit of its citizens, and that's jeopardized, then the state will come in and basically oversee their finances, not completely direct them. It doesn't get rid of the local government. We still have a mayor, we still have a city council, and they had responsibilities all throughout Act 47. But it just provides a level of state oversight to, one, write a recovery plan to identify like how the municipality got into the situation and how they're hopefully going to get out, and then two, provide some cover for the city to make some hard decisions. And that's typically related to collective bargaining agreements, because the law, when it was originally written in 1987, said that you can't have a collective bargaining agreement that would break the finances of the plan. So when a municipality goes to negotiate with its employees, they can typically say, well, we'd like to give you a blank percentage raise or these types of benefits, but we can't because the recovery plan doesn't allow us to. Now, that's been modified a bit because of state amendments, and now they can allow the municipality to say, well, we will want to give our employees these benefits, and here's how we're going to find the savings somewhere else. And there's a little bit more latitude in that sense. But really what it is, it's a way for the state to come in and oversee municipalities' finances to get them out of trouble, and then hopefully once they're out, they never come back in.
Right. Now, since the plan has been in law since '87, a few municipalities have been in it, but none of them have been the size of Pittsburgh. And if memory serves, when the city requested Act 47 status, it was a bit contentious because the program was not set up to handle a city the size of Pittsburgh. But a lot of speculation was the officials in Pittsburgh were looking for the commuter tax. Could you give a little background on the commuter tax and why it never came to be here in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, sure. When you have a municipality that goes into Act 47, they can, with the approval of the courts annually, go and petition for an increase in their wage tax. Now, most everybody in the listening area here and across the states pays a wage tax. And the way that the state law is written is essentially every municipality has the ability to tax its residents and the people that work there. But because of the way that the law is set up with crediting, typically if you work in another municipality, your home municipality is already charging you a wage tax. So when it's 1%, you're already paying it at home. So there's really nothing to be gained by saying we're going to tax non-residents. What the Act 47 statute allows is for the community that's in financial distress to raise the rates above what it normally could in order to capture a portion of the wages, to tax the wages of the people who don't live in the municipality but do work there. But the catch is that you also have to increase it on your own residents. You can't just say, if you don't live here but you work here, we're going to garnish or tax 0.3% of your wages. You'll still pay the 1% to your home community. Basically, you'd have to put it on Pittsburgh residents. And what happened with Pittsburgh's case was they passed a separate overseer because, as you alluded to, there aren't a lot of municipalities in Act 47 or that have come out that were the size of Pittsburgh. I mean, Pittsburgh is the second biggest city in the state. The legislators who said, well, we have an oversight board in Philadelphia. We'd like to have something similar in Pittsburgh because they can take a broader look at things than an Act 47 team could. We're going to put them in place. And, oh, by the way, when they're in place and for as long as they are in place, Pittsburgh is just prohibited from levying a commuter tax. So it never became an issue here other than the very early days, and you and I probably remember them well in 2003. As the city was heading in, what the belief was about, well, that if they go into Act 47, this is the chance that they'll have to go and get the residents of the suburban communities who work at Pittsburgh and then go home but don't pay taxes other than what at the time was a $10 occupation privilege tax.
Okay, so 2003, the city finds its way into Act 47. They have an oversight board. Now, here we are 14 years later. And think about this. This is a neat little factoid that went through my head. Not only did the Steelers win a Super Bowl, the Eagles have won a Super Bowl, and the city got out of Act 47 status. Now, which one of those three things do you think would be least likely to happen?
Oh, my gosh, in that 14-year period, right?
So what did the city do right to get themselves out of Act 47?
Well, I wish it was as simple as saying, here's the recovery plan, here's what they did underneath it, and here's how they got out. The issue is because of Pittsburgh's situation, there was a lot of other state laws that came into play at the time. The Oversight Board, that was a separate state statute. There were tax reforms that happened beyond what Pittsburgh could tax that created some new taxes. They had to phase out some old ones. They got a piece of money from the school district on their wage tax. That came from a separate state law. Then you had a municipal pension reform law that came in 2009. Then you had the amendments to Act 47. So it's a lot of things that came together. But basically what they had to focus on, I think, by and large, was their legacy costs. So your pensions, retiree health care, workers' comp, debt, which going in, people knew that they were problems. Some of that didn't come to light, especially on retiree health care, because prior to their time in Act 47, really no municipality ever really accounted for their retiree health care benefits. They just said, we're paying this much money per year. When they had to start to state it on a long-term liability status, and you saw the number at first, and they said, well, they have nothing set aside to pay it. Wow, that was really shocking. So basically, they cut off retiree health care for new hires. They have put more money into the pension system. I mean, a lot more money than is required. They did like a 30-year parking tax commitment. But the plans themselves, I mean, they did have directives about how to work with other governments. Could they, cooperate? Could they outsource things? There were some things that never came to light. I mean, garbage privatization was one of the things in one of the recovery plans where they said, we're going to do a test program just to see how well this works. That never came about. Just the workforce and collective bargaining changes. And then when the state amended Act 47 in 2014, they said, there has to be a time limit here. We cannot leave municipalities in here forever. So it's either you get out within 5 years, you disincorporate, and you're basically run by the state. You try to merge with some other neighboring community. Pittsburgh, again, getting back to the point of how big it was, the number of employees, the services it provided, it was never really going to disincorporate. So it was left to, is the time right? And they met the requirements of the state law, which is basically for the next 5 years, they're supposed to be operating surpluses. They never borrowed any money that they had to pay back in order to get out of distress status. There was no lawsuits or claims against them that was going to jeopardize their financial health. So that's really how they met the requirements in order to get out. And then to prevent them from going back in, you hope that never happens. Those amendments also set up an early intervention program so that the state is supposed to look at the municipalities and say, okay, yeah, you're starting to exhibit some characteristics that probably are going to set you up for financial distress. How do we solve them now?
Right. Wow, that is really good stuff. I would like to thank my colleague Eric for joining me today. I would like to thank our listeners for tuning in. If you would like more information on this or other topics, I would invite you to visit our website at AlleghenyInstitute.org. Thank you very much.
The federal government has cut taxes, but Governor Tom Wolf wants to raise state taxes. Beth Ann Mumford of Americans for Prosperity Pennsylvania explains on this Lincoln Radio Journal commentary.
Blessed with abundant natural resources, a skilled workforce, and some of the nation's top universities, Pennsylvania is a place filled with promise, a state where business can grow and people of all backgrounds can get ahead. With the passage of federal tax reform, the Keystone State is on the cusp of fulfilling its economic potential, so long as Harrisburg is wise enough to stay out of the way. Unfortunately, it seems that Governor Tom Wolf and some in the legislature are doing all they can to thwart Pennsylvania's promise with overregulation, higher taxes, and wasteful spending. Take the governor's new proposal to double the salary threshold under which full-time workers are eligible for overtime pay. If the aim of the policy is to help workers, then it's bound to backfire. The rule would simply foist new compliance costs on businesses, which could force them to cut hours and wages. In the words of Nate Benefield of the Commonwealth Foundation, Governor Wolf can no more mandate that every Pennsylvania worker earn more money than he can mandate that every family has a pet unicorn. The legislature knows the rule will do more harm than good, which is why the governor has been forced to circumvent lawmakers and enact the new rule by executive fiat. It's not the first time he's resorted to such tactics to push through his job-killing ideas. on December 22nd, the same day President Donald Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act into law, Wolf quietly modified Pennsylvania's tax policies to prevent businesses from taking full advantage of the newly lowered rates on capital investments. The Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association says the change will lead to hundreds of millions in additional taxes and unnecessary administrative costs. At a time when many businesses in the U.S. are looking to expand their operations, the governor's action will serve as a warning to business owners to take their companies and their jobs elsewhere. Rather than work to build a favorable business climate to attract new investment in Pennsylvania, Wolf has taken to lure large corporations such as Amazon with taxpayer money. Both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia are on the short list of cities being considered for the site of Amazon's second headquarters. If either were chosen, Amazon would receive a hefty package of economic incentives at taxpayer expense. Wolf refuses to release the details of that offer, but it would probably be the biggest ever rewarded by the state, according to Community and Economic Development Secretary Dennis Davin. In other words, it would likely outweigh even the $1.7 billion tax handout given to Shell Oil Company to build a refinery in western PA. Such corporate welfare schemes rarely deliver the promised jobs or tax revenue, and they unfairly benefit large corporations at the expense of the little guy. There are more than 1 million small businesses in Pennsylvania, employing just under half of all employees. They may not generate headlines like Amazon does, but they are no less important to the overall economy, and they too deserve fair and equal tax treatment. If state lawmakers want to create growth and opportunity, they should lower taxes for everyone rather than cut deals with politically favored corporations. They should also target more than 153 state regulations that are weighing down our economy. A package of regulatory reform bills were recently introduced in the General Assembly. Why not start there? Leaders in Washington have done much to eliminate barriers to prosperity and increase economic opportunity over the last year. But lawmakers in Harrisburg and the governor aren't matching their successes. We cannot make good on Pennsylvania's promise until state lawmakers pass their own reforms to increase government transparency, lower taxes, and eliminate the regulatory burdens that are holding all of us back. I'm Beth Ann Mumford, State Director of Americans for Prosperity. Find us on the web at www.afppennsylvania.com.
If you miss hearing Lincoln Radio Journal on your favorite radio station, audio of our complete program is available on our websites, lincolnradiojournal.com and lincolninstitute.org. For 23 years, Lincoln Radio Journal has been heard on public affairs-minded radio stations throughout the Commonwealth, including WBHV-AM in Somerset, along with WOWY-FM in State College, and WMBS AM and FM in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Leadership Conference this year will be held April 6th and 7th at the Radisson Penn Harris Convention Center in Camp Hill. The Pennsylvania Leadership Conference is the premier conservative event each year here in the Keystone State. This year's featured dinner speaker will be Fox News contributor Byron York. There will be a wide array of speakers, including former U.S. Senator Tom Coburn, along with issue panels and workshops. You can get complete information and register for this year's Pennsylvania Leadership Conference at paleadershipconference.org. The Lincoln Radio Journal is produced weekly by the Lincoln Institute of Public Opinion Research, Incorporated. The Lincoln Institute is completely funded through the generosity of individuals, corporations, and philanthropic foundations, including the Houston Foundation of Coatesville, the Worrell Foundation of Carlisle, the Allegheny Foundation of Pittsburgh, and the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association, all of whom have helped to underwrite the costs of this program. Lincoln Radio Journal is a trademark of the Lincoln Institute of Public Opinion Research, Incorporated. Comments and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Lincoln Institute or of this radio station. From the Lincoln Broadcast Center in Harrisburg, I'm Loman Henry. Thank you for listening to Pennsylvania's most widely broadcast public affairs radio program, Lincoln Radio Journal. Plug into the pulse of Pennsylvania.